Okay, let's dive in. I want you to try and picture this just for a second. Imagine being part of something called an ethnological exposition.
Sounds quite academic, doesn't it?
It does, but the reality, well, one of our sources highlights, these were essentially human zoos.
Hmm.
Real people, often from non-Western cultures, put on display, sometimes literally in pens.
And not just ancient history either. The source mentions this happening disturbingly recently, even into the early 2000s.
Exactly. Think about Sarah Bartman. Enslaved at 16, displayed in Europe because her body was seen as different, kept half naked in a cage. A spectacle.
It's just horrific. And even after her death, her body parts were displayed for decades, only returned home for burial in 2002.
It's a profoundly unsettling example, isn't it? Really shows the absolute extreme of judging people based purely on the group they belong to.
It really does.
And that's dark history. It leads us right into today's deep dive. We've got quite a stack of sources here, all digging into prejudice, discrimination, stereotypes.
Yeah, trying to get to the heart of it all.
Our mission really is to sift through this complexity, pull out the key insights. What do these terms really mean? Where do they come from? Who gets targeted? And importantly, what do the sources suggest about, well, overcoming them?
It's like we're breaking down the ABCs of how we relate to groups that aren't our own.
The ABCs. I like that frame. A for affect prejudice, the feeling.
B for behavior discrimination, the action, the treatment.
And C for cognition stereotypes, the beliefs, the thoughts.
So let's get those definitions clear first, because the sources draw some really crucial lines. Prejudice, as you said, is the effect, the feeling.
A negative feeling towards someone.
Right, but based solely on their group membership, not on them as an individual.
Yeah, the prejudgment feeling.
Mm.
And discrimination then is acting on that, or maybe just acting on the idea of difference itself.
Exactly, it's the unequal treatment that follows because of their group.
Okay. And stereotypes. Those are the beliefs, the
Right.
associations we make.
Yes, associating groups with certain traits. And the sources point out these can be positive or negative, although, let's be honest, the focus is usually on the negative ones.
Like thinking everyone from X place is lazy, or all Y people are good at math. Even the positive ones, like saying a group is naturally musical, can be limiting, right?
Definitely limiting. Now, the sources also bring up something called aversive racism. This one's interesting.
Oh, yeah.
It's when someone genuinely holds egalitarian values. They believe in racial equality,
Okay.
but they simultaneously have these lingering negative feelings or discomfort around people from other racial groups.
So it's not outright hate, more like avoidance.
Precisely.
Mm.
It often leads to discomfort, maybe anxiety in interracial interactions, subtle avoidance behaviors, not necessarily conscious hostility, but that underlying negative feeling leaks out.
That sounds very contemporary. People consciously rejecting racism, but maybe still feeling awkward or acting differently without meaning to.
The sources mention studies, white Americans perhaps sitting a bit further away, less eye contact, shorter chats with Black Americans. Not intentional malice, maybe, but driven by that inner conflict.
It's subtle but impactful, and quite a contrast to history, as the sources note. This idea that prejudice is morally wrong, that's fairly modern, culturally speaking, mostly Western.
Absolutely. Historically, judging people by category, that was often the norm, even written into law.
Which brings us right back to the human zoos, to Sarah Bartman. That wasn't just random cruelty, it was systemic discrimination accepted by society.
A chilling reminder. Okay, so we have the definitions. Let's talk about who typically becomes the target.
It seems to revolve around perceived differences, right?
Sure.
Visible ones, sometimes invisible ones.
Exactly. Obvious ones like racism and gender sexism are foundational examples in the sources, but they detail others too.
Like who?
Well, Muslims, for instance. The sources highlight a surge in prejudice, especially in the West post 9/11. Negative, violent words get associated disproportionately with Islam.
And the source makes that crucial point. Most Muslims globally are not Arabs.
A very important distinction. Interestingly, the sources also mention that for Muslims facing discrimination, their faith itself often becomes a source of strength, a buffer against the psychological toll.
That makes sense.
Who else? Foreigners. Xenophobia, that fear or hatred of outsiders. South Africa is used as a key example.
Ah, the violence against other African nationals there.
Yes, linked often to perceived competition for scarce resources, jobs, housing, services, that narrative of foreigners flooding the country.
I remember reading about those incidents, 2008, 2015, mob violence, looting foreign shops while local ones were untouched, sometimes starting as protests about something else entirely.
Grim stuff. Then there's the persecution of people with albinism, particularly in parts of sub-Saharan Africa.
That's connected to witchcraft beliefs, isn't it? Horrific violence.
Truly horrific. Killings, dismemberment, driven by myths about body parts bringing wealth or power. And even beyond that extreme, there's constant bullying, teasing, social exclusion.
The sources also spend time on prejudice against people who are overweight.
Right. And what's striking there is how open people often are about anti-fat attitudes compared to, say, racism.
Because it's often seen as self-inflicted, like it reflects negatively on their character.
That seems to be a common justification.
Yeah.
And it leads to real discrimination. In hiring, yes, but even in things like university admissions.
University admissions. Really?
Yeah, one study found heavier applicants, especially women, got fewer grad school offers even when their recommendations were just as good.
Wow, okay. What about sexual orientation? Homophobia?
Another major focus, it's not always visible, obviously, but the prejudice can be incredibly strong, sometimes even from family. The sources show a painful story. View to Fanny, whose parents basically said, choose us or your sexuality.
Terrible. And this leads to discrimination in jobs, public life.
And healthcare, which is really concerning. Negative attitudes from healthcare workers, particularly noted in Africa. There was that study with the gay pride t-shirt.
Oh, yeah, where people wearing it were less likely to get help asking for change.
Exactly. Shows how pervasive it can be in just everyday interactions.
The sources had some interesting thoughts on why anti-gay prejudice exists too, didn't they?
Yeah.
Stronger in men, often aimed at their own gender.
Right. Linked possibly to fear of unwanted advances or maybe even fear of being seen as gay themselves. That need to assert masculinity. The sources kind of push back on the unnatural or purely religious arguments, noting homosexuality occurs in nature and across human history, suggesting fear might be a bigger driver.
And they briefly mention other stigmas too, like mental illness, poverty.
Yes, chronic sickness, physical blemishes. Basically, any characteristic that marks someone as different can become a hook for prejudice.
Okay, so we've got the ABCs and a sense of who gets targeted. Now the big question, why? Why does prejudice exist at all? The sources dig into several theories.
Yeah, it's not simple. One starting point is innate or learned.
Is it something we're born with or something society teaches us?
Well, one perspective strongly argues it's learned. The specific stereotypes, the negative beliefs about this group or that group, we learn those from our culture, our families, our peers.
Makes sense. You don't invent these ideas in a vacuum.
But then there's the counter-argument. Maybe the tendency to categorize, to prefer our own group, maybe that's more deeply rooted, almost innate.
What's the evidence for that?
Sources cite things like babies showing race-based preferences very early on, like 6 months old, primates treating outsider groups as enemies, and the minimal group effect you put people in totally random groups, say, based on a coin toss.
And they immediately favor their own coin toss group.
Instantly, even when it's completely meaningless. So the thinking is perhaps the readiness to divide the world into us and them is fundamental, but who they are and what we think about them is culturally learned.
So, bit of both. The tendency is deep, the content is learned.
That seems to be the synthesis, yeah. Then there's the whole use versus them dynamic, fueled by competition.
Oh, the Robbers Cave study. That one's a classic.
It really is. You take these 11-year-old boys, divide them, let them bond within their groups. Perfectly fine.
Until you make them compete.
Exactly. Introduce prizes, competitive games, baseball, tug of war, and boom, hostility erupts. Name-calling, burning flags, raiding cabins, food fights.
Just like that. It's amazing how quickly competition turned them against each other.
And this feeds into realistic conflict theory. When groups perceive they're competing for limited resources, jobs, land, status, whatever, hostility is almost a natural outcome.
Like the South Africa xenophobia example, again, the perception of competition over jobs fueling violence.
Precisely. The sources do note competition isn't all bad. It drives innovation, progress, but it clearly has this dark side. They also mention some societies are highly cooperative, non-competitive, but often lack the scale or power of competitive ones.
Okay, so innate tendencies, competition. What else?
Cognitive shortcuts. Stereotypes as mental heuristics.
The brain being lazy, basically.
Huh. Sort of. The law of least effort. Our brains are cognitive misers. They prefer easy routes. Applying a stereotype takes less mental energy than sizing up every single person individually.
And there's research backing this up.
Yes, the study where labeling someone a skinhead actually freed up mental resources, allowing participants to remember more from a separate task, and we rely on them more when we're tired or distracted, like morning people tested at night.
Right. But again, the content of these shortcuts isn't neutral. It's learned from our in-group.
Exactly. It's not necessarily accurate. It's just efficient, mentally speaking.
Are there emotional reasons too? Does prejudice make people feel better somehow?
Absolutely. Self-esteem comes into play. Thinking negatively about an outgroup can make your own group seem superior, which in turn boosts your self-esteem.
Putting others down to feel good about yourself seems unfortunately common.
It can operate subconsciously, but the effect is there. Related to this is using stereotypes to rationalize inequality.
Rationalization for oppression, how does that work?
Stereotypes can justify why things are the way they are, why one group has power and another doesn't. Think historical justifications for slavery, apartheid, or sexism stereotypes were used to make these systems seem natural, deserved, even necessary.
Like saying women weren't suited for education because it was bad for their health.
Exactly, a stereotype justifying exclusion.
Yeah.
And then there's scapegoat theory.
Blaming others for your problems.
Pretty much. It ties into the self-serving bias we like to take credit for success, but blame failures on external factors or other groups. Blaming immigrants for unemployment, for example, fits this perfectly.
A way to deflect responsibility and frustration onto an easy target.
And stress makes it worse. Conflict, feeling threatened, that tends to bring stereotypes to the surface more readily. The study about seeing fearful outgroup faces as angry if you already hold that negative stereotype, it shows how bias warps perception under pressure.
Okay, one last piece on the why, how do stereotypes actually operate in our thinking. The sources said they're not just fixed ideas.
Right. They often act more like hypotheses. We look for evidence to confirm them. The Hannah study is the key example here.
The one with the girl from a supposedly rich or poor background?
That's the one. People didn't judge her intelligence based only on the background info. But when they watched a video of her taking a test where her performance was deliberately ambiguous.
They interpreted it through the lens of the stereotype.
Exactly. Confirmation bias. If they thought she was rich, they saw her succeeding, focused on the questions she got right, confirming the smart stereotype. If they thought she was poor, they focused on her struggles, confirming the less capable stereotype. Same video, different interpretations based on the initial bias.
Wow, okay, so the why is complicated. Innate tendencies, cultural learning, competition, mental shortcuts, boosting self-esteem, justifying inequality, scapegoating, biased information processing. It's a lot.
It really shows how deep the roots go, which makes understanding the impact on those targeted even more crucial.
Yeah, let's pivot to that. Being on the receiving end, it's obviously unpleasant, particularly negative stereotypes. The source mentioned that study where men reacted aggressively to negative female stereotypes.
Yes, sending offensive images shows the kind of hostile reactions stereotypes can provoke.
And then there's the whole self-fulfilling prophecy idea.
Right, where someone's expectation actually causes the expected behavior. The classic intellectual bloomers study in schools is often cited.
But the sources added some nuance there, didn't they? Saying the real-world effects might be smaller, and teacher expectations are often accurate anyway.
Correct. It's not always a self-fulfilling prophecy. And crucially, people don't just passively accept negative stereotypes about themselves. They resist.
How? What are these self-protection mechanisms?
One big one is attributing failure to prejudice.
Blaming bias instead of blaming yourself.
Essentially, yes. The study with Black students getting critical essay feedback is a great example. If they thought the evaluator knew their race, getting negative feedback didn't dent their self-esteem as much. They could attribute it to possible prejudice, protecting their sense of competence.
That's really interesting. It shows agency, people actively managing the psychological impact.
Definitely. Another strategy for stigmas that aren't visible is concealing them.
Like sexual orientation or maybe religious beliefs in certain contexts?
Exactly. The sources call it internalizing the closet, managing a public self that's different from your private reality to avoid negative judgment.
Then there was that more complex idea, competitive victimhood.
Ah, yes, a potentially controversial one.
Yeah.
The idea that groups might sometimes compete for the status of victim.
Why would they do that?
The sources suggest perceived benefits, maybe seeking sympathy, resources, or a kind of moral authority. The examples given were things like framing South African farm murders solely as targeting white people, or using a specific racist incident to represent widespread anti-Black racism. Claiming victimhood might also, paradoxically, reduce feelings of guilt within a group.
That's a tricky dynamic. Okay, what else impacts targets?
Stereotype threat. This one is huge.
That's the fear of confirming a negative stereotype, which then actually hurts your performance.
Precisely. The fear itself creates anxiety, which consumes mental energy needed for the task. So, ironically, worrying about fulfilling the stereotype makes it more likely.
Examples like women on math tests, white men compared to Asian men on certain tasks.
Black students versus white students on academic tests,
Right.
the list goes on. The anxiety interferes with cognitive function.
And it can affect anyone, right? The sources mention white people worrying about seeming racist in interactions.
Exactly. It's not limited to one group.
Right.
It adds this extra layer of pressure, this significant burden, especially when the stakes are high. The good news, sources suggest, is it might be possible to buffer against it, like the example of older adults doing better after positive interactions with grandkids, maybe reducing anxiety about age stereotypes.
So targets are constantly navigating this stuff, protecting self-esteem, sometimes hiding parts of themselves, dealing with the pressure of stereotype threat. It sounds exhausting.
It really does. Which leads us to the final big question. How can we actually overcome this? Reduce prejudice? Counter stereotypes? What do the sources suggest works?
One key concept seemed to be the conscious override.
Yes, the duplex mind idea. We have this fast automatic system that throws up associations, including stereotypes, but we also have a slower conscious system that can step in and say, hang on, that's not fair, or that doesn't align with my values.
But that takes effort, right?
Wow. A significant amount. Remember the study showing people were mentally tired after interracial conversations. That's likely the effort of monitoring and overriding those automatic biases. People low in prejudice aren't necessarily unaware of stereotypes. They're just better at consciously rejecting them.
And why people make that effort matters too. The internal versus external motivation.
Big difference. Internal motivation, I personally believe prejudice is wrong, leads to more genuine, consistent, non-prejudiced behavior. External motivation, I don't want people to think I'm prejudiced, might lead to public compliance, but private bias, maybe even backlash later.
So personal conviction is key for real change. What about practical methods, things we can do?
Well, the contact hypothesis comes up again. Simply putting groups together isn't enough. The contact needs to be positive.
Under the right conditions, like
But-
equal status, working together.
Exactly. Equal status, common goals, support from authorities. Even indirect contact helps knowing someone in your group has a good friend in the outgroup, or even just imagining positive contact.
And that ties into superordinate goals, like in the Robbers Cave study.
Precisely. Those goals that groups have to cooperate on to achieve. Fixing the water supply in the camp, pooling money for a movie, those tasks forced the boys to work together and reduced hostility. Cooperation is a powerful antidote.
And the Jigsaw classroom is basically applying that in schools.
It is a very practical application. Each student gets a unique piece of information needed for the group project. They have to rely on each other, teach each other, and the research shows it works, reduces prejudice, improves grades, used successfully worldwide.
So it comes down to conscious effort, genuine motivation, fostering positive interactions, and creating situations that demand cooperation.
Those seem to be the key takeaways from the sources on how to move forward.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together. What does this whole exploration of prejudice tell us about, well, what makes us human?
The sources seem to suggest that while the tendency towards groupiness, maybe even conflict, might have deep roots, maybe shared with other animals,
Humans add these incredible layers of complexity, meaning values, culture.
exactly. We don't just fight over territory, we create elaborate belief systems, stereotypes, and teach them to our children, embedding them culturally.
And that cultural layer massively increases the impact prejudice has, right?
Yeah.
Affecting jobs, housing, health, life chances in ways animal conflict just doesn't.
Absolutely. And ironically, prejudice can also strengthen bonds within our own group. Categorizing them helps solidify us.
But the sources end on a more optimistic note, don't they?
They do. Unlike other animals, we have this capacity for reflection, for conscious change. We can look at our tendencies and decide to act differently.
We can try to restructure society like the efforts, however imperfect, in post-apartheid South Africa. We can work on ourselves, make that conscious override effort.
That ability to consciously aim for tolerance, for cooperation, for harmony, even in diverse societies, that's presented as a uniquely hopeful aspect of human culture. The ability to rise above the automatic antagonism.
To say, okay, that's my first impulse, but is it right? Is it the one I choose?
That's the core of it.
Wow. We've really journeyed through a lot. From those disturbing human zoos, through the ABCs of prejudice, discrimination, stereotypes.
To the tangled reasons they exist: innate bits, learned bits, competition, mental shortcuts, ego defenses, biased thinking,
Looking at the real burden on those targeted and how they cope and resist.
and finally exploring what it takes to overcome it, conscious effort, motivation, positive contact, cooperation.
It paints a picture of prejudice as, yes, deeply rooted and complex, but not insurmountable. Our ability to understand it and consciously fight it seems central to human cultural progress.
Leaves you thinking, though, doesn't it?
It really does. That final question lingers. In your own day-to-day life, what does it really take to look past the group label, the stereotype, and see the individual in front of you? And maybe more pointedly, how much mental energy are you actually willing to spend on making that conscious override happen?